friends, welcome back or welcome to Dark Roast Caffeine Case Files. I'm your host, Kate. Grab your favorite choice of caffeine and let's get started. Today, I'm talking about Robert Pickton. But before we get started, just a quick listener discretion. I am going to talk about missing women, drug use, alcohol use, violence, and murder. So please take care of yourself while listening. If you're not able to listen to this episode, please skip this one and you can always come back another time. Let's begin with a place, not the farm, not yet. Let's begin with a neighborhood that for decades has existed in the shadow of one of the world's most beautiful cities. Vancouver, British Columbia, sits on the traditional territory of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It's a city of mountains and ocean, of glass condominiums, $1 billion real estate. It's consistently ranked as one of the most livable cities on earth. But if you walk east from the gleaming waterfront, past the boutiques of Gastown, past the tourists taking pictures of the world's first steam clock, you will eventually cross an invisible line. The air changes, the sidewalks become narrower, more crowded. The store selling artisanal coffee gives way to pawn shops, cheap dollar stores, and storefront churches. The polished shoes of office workers are replaced by worn-out sneakers and bare feet. You've entered the downtown east side. To call it a neighborhood doesn't quite capture it. It is a postcard from the underbelly of a wealthy nation. It is roughly 10 city blocks, a grid of aging brick buildings, and alleys that smell of urine and garbage. It is home to approximately 18,000 people, but it's also a destination, a last resort for the addicted, the mentally ill, the dispossessed from across Western Canada. This is a place with its own brutal economy. The primary currency is drugs, cocaine, heroin, and later, the synthetic opiate crisis that would decimate the population. To feed that currency, there is another economy, the sex trade. On any given night, almost any corner, women stand in the rain, in the cold, waiting for cars to slow down. They are trading the only thing they have left for the only relief they can find. And in the 1990s, one of the cars that slowed down belonged to a pig farmer from Port Coquitlam. But here's what you need to understand before we go any further. These women were not abstractions. They were not just addicts or sex workers, or any of the other labels that allow society to look away. They were daughters, they were mothers, they were sisters. They were Cree, Carrier, Salish, and Métis women who carried with them the legacy of generations of residential schools, of a colonial system that had systematically devalued their lives for centuries. The story of Robert Pickton is not just the story of a monster. It's the story of a society that created the perfect hunting ground, then refused to see the hunter until it was far too late. Robert William Pickton was born on October 24th, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, a rural municipality about an hour's drive east of Vancouver. His parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton, were pig farmers. They owned a parcel of land on Dominion Avenue, a stretch of road that was then mostly farmland, dotted with modest houses and working properties. To understand Robert, you have to understand the Pickton household, and you have to understand Louise. Louise Pickton was the undisputed matriarch. She was a hard woman, described by those who knew her as domineering, abrasive, and obsessed with the farm. She worked her sons like laborers. Before school, after school, on weekends. The boys were in the pens, shoveling manure, hauling feed, tending to the hogs. Personal hygiene was not a priority in the Pickton house. Louise would send Robert and his younger brother David to school in clothes that were crusted with pig waste, unwashed, reeking. The other children with the casual cruelty of kids, called them Stinky Piggy. They were outcasts before they even had a chance to be anything else. Robert's father, Leonard, was a different kind of presence. He was a violent man, prone to rages. There are accounts of him beating his sons, of the household being one of fear and tension. But Leonard was also a distant figure, often absent, leaving Louise as the primary force in Robert's life. And Louise, for all her harshness, was also the only person who showed Robert any semblance of attention. He became intensely attached to her, a bond that would shape his entire understanding of women as figures of authority, of labor, of the farm itself. Robert was not like other children. He struggled academically, failed the second grade, and was placed in special education classes. He was described as slow, not just intellectually, but socially. He had a flat affect, difficulty connecting with peers, and a seeming inability to understand social cues. He lived in his own world, a world circumscribed by the farm, by the pigs, by his mother. There's a story from his childhood that psychiatrists and profilers would later point to as a defining moment. When Robert was about 12 years old, he saved up his own money, maybe from odd jobs, maybe from allowances, and bought a small calf. He raised it by hand. He fed it, he cleaned it, he talked to it. In a rare moment of candor, a psychiatrist years later, he said, quote, "I wanted to sleep with it. I played with the calf, everything else." End quote. It was his pet. It was perhaps the first and only living creature he ever felt affection for. One afternoon, he came home from school and the calf was gone. He ran through the house, panicked, asking his family where it was. They told him, almost casually, to check the barn. He didn't want to go. He knew what happened in the barn. That was the slaughterhouse. That was where the pigs were killed and butchered. In an interview decades later, his voice changed when he recalled this moment. He described sneaking around the back of the building, peeking through a crack in the boards, and there it was, his calf, hanging upside down, its throat cut, its belly split open, gutted, cleaned out, dead. The animal he had loved had been transformed into meat. This is the moment, many believe, where something fundamentally broke in Robert Pickton. The line between love and slaughter, between a living creature and a product to be consumed, was erased. The lesson was clear. Everything on the farm was meat, eventually, even the things you loved. He dropped out of school entirely around the age of 14, in 1963. He had no friends, no interests outside the farm, no future that anyone could see. But he did have one skill. He could handle a knife. He apprenticed as a butcher, learning the trade of cutting meat, of disassembling carcasses, of making animal flesh disappear into neat packages. He worked as a butcher for about 7 years before returning to the family farm full-time. By then, he was in his early 20s, a quiet, strange man who had already learned the two things that would define his life: how to kill and how to dispose of the evidence. In the late 1970s, both parents died. Leonard in 1978, Louise in 1979. The farm, now valued for its land more than its pigs, passed to Robert, David, and their sister Linda, who had been sent away to live with relatives as a child and had little to do with the property. Almost immediately, the brothers sold off a massive chunk of the land to developers. Port Coquitlam was growing, and the farmland was being converted into suburbs. Robert and David suddenly found themselves millionaires. They had cash, they had land, and they had absolutely no idea what to do with it. They didn't move, they didn't upgrade. They stayed in the same dilapidated trailers on the remaining 7 acres. They lived in squalor, surrounded by junk, rusting vehicles, and wandering pigs. They were rich, but they were still the stinky Piggy boys, incapable of escaping the filth they'd been raised in. The dynamic between the brothers is important to understand. David was the older, more outgoing, more dominant of the two. He was the businessman, the front man. He handled the money, the deals, the interactions with the outside world. Robert was the laborer, the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background and did the dirty work. David partied, Robert worked. David talked, Robert listened. But Robert had his own world. He built a small workshop next to his trailer. This was his space. He filled it with tools and with odd collections. It was also where he did the butchering, not just of pigs, but of whatever else needed to be cut up. Neighbors would later recall him hauling things into that workshop, things that didn't look like farm animals. And Robert also had an appetite, not for fancy food or fine wine, but for the same thing that had been a constant in his life since childhood. The visceral, the grotesque. He was fascinated by the process of death, by the mechanics of it. He would later tell an undercover officer that he'd been killing things since he was a kid. It was just what you did on a farm. The 1980s were a quiet period. The brothers lived their strange, isolated lives. But the seeds of what was to come were being planted. Robert was making connections of a sort. He would drive his old truck into Vancouver, not to the nice parts, but to the edges, to the Skid Row areas. He was drawn to the margins, to the people who wouldn't be missed. In the early 1990s, the Pickton brothers had an idea. They had money, they had space, and they had a large farm building that wasn't being used for much. Why not throw parties? They converted the building into a rough and ready nightclub. They installed a bar, a sound system, lights. They called it the Picky Palace Good Times Society. And here's the bizarre part. They registered it as a non-profit society with the provincial government. The stated purpose? To provide a meeting place for community groups, to raise money for charity, to host events for worthy causes. In reality, it was a roadhouse, a biker bar, a party spot. They threw massive events with live bands. All-you-can-drink booze and plenty of drugs. The word spread through the local underworld. If you wanted a wild night out, you went to the Pickton farm. And Robert, for the first time in his life, was a host. He was someone. He had a role. He would wander through the crowds, a strange, silent figure, but he was there. He was part of it. But the parties served another purpose. They brought women to the farm, lots of women. And Robert started making trips into Vancouver, specifically to the downtown east side, to bring more. He wasn't charming, he wasn't handsome, but he had a truck and he had money. For women living in the depths of addiction, a ride to a party on a farm with the promise of cash and drugs could seem like a lifeline. Some went, partied, and came back. They told others that the Pickton farm was a place to go if you needed to make some quick money. But others noticed something strange. Robert would sometimes pull women aside. He'd offer them more money to come to his trailer. Some went. Some came back with stories that made others uneasy. He was weird, they said. He had handcuffs. He had a weird way of looking at you. And then, some just never came back at all. It's impossible to know exactly when the killings started. Pickton himself would later confess to killing women as early as the 1970s, but the forensic evidence only goes back so far. What we do know is that by the mid-1990s, women were disappearing from the downtown east side at an alarming rate, and many of them had been seen at the Pickton farm. Before we go any further, we need to stop. We need to talk about who these women were. not as victims, not as case numbers, but as people. Because the greatest tragedy of the Pickton case is not that they just died, but that the world was so slow to care that they were gone. Let's start with Sarah DeVries. Sarah was born in 1969 in New Brunswick. She was of mixed race, black and white, and she was given up for adoption as an infant. She was adopted by a loving family in Vancouver and grew up in a stable, middle-class home. She was bright, articulate, and creative. She wrote poetry. She kept detailed journals. She wanted to be a writer. But Sarah struggled. She felt a sense of displacement, of not quite belonging. In her teens, she fell into the drug scene. By her early 20s, she was living on the streets of the downtown East Side, addicted to heroin, working as a sex worker to support her habit. But even in the depths of her addiction, Sarah never stopped writing. Her journals are a haunting window into the mind of someone living on the edge. In 1998, she wrote an entry that would prove prophetic. Quote, "Am I next? Is he watching me now, stalking me like a predator and its prey? Waiting for some perfect spot, time, or my stupid mistake. I feel him near sometimes. I look behind me. But there is only the rain and the dark. So many of us are gone, so many, and no one seems to notice but us." End quote. Sarah DeVries disappeared on April 14, 1998. She was 29 years old. Her DNA would later be found on Robert Pickton's farm. Her journals were published after her death, a testament to a voice that was silenced too soon. Marnie Frey was a young mother. She was born in Campbell River, British Columbia, in 1974. She had a daughter, Brittany, when she was just 17. Marnie struggled with addiction, but she loved her daughter fiercely. When she was using, she would sometimes leave Brittany with her father and stepmother, Rick and Lynn Frey, who raised the little girl. Marnie would come and go from their lives, always promising to get clean, always hoping for a better life. She moved to the downtown East Side, drawn by the cheap drugs, but she kept in touch with her family. Her father, Rick Frey, never stopped looking for her. He would drive into Vancouver, walk the streets, hand out flyers with her picture. He became a fixture at community meetings, demanding that police take the disappearances seriously. Marnie was last seen in August 1997. She was 23 years old. Rick Frey would sit through every day of Robert Pickton's trial, holding a framed photograph of his daughter. Georgina Papin was a vibrant, spirited woman from the Paul First Nation in Alberta. She was born in 1971. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter. She had a smile that people remembered, a laugh that could fill a room. Georgina struggled with addiction, like so many others, but her family never stopped loving her. They never stopped hoping she would come home. She moved to Vancouver in the 1990s. Seeking a fresh start, she ended up in the downtown East Side. Her family would get letters from her, sometimes, or phone calls. Then the calls stopped. Georgina Papin disappeared in the spring of 1999. She was 28 years old. Andrea Josbury was born in 1974 in Victoria. She was described by her mother, Pamela Ross, as a bright, artistic child who loved to draw and write. Andrea fell into addiction as a teenager and spent years cycling in and out of recovery. Her mother never gave up on her. She would drive to Vancouver, searching the streets, checking the hospitals, hoping for a glimpse of her daughter. Andrea was last seen in June 2001. She was 27. Pamela Ross became one of the most vocal advocates for the missing women, speaking at rallies, demanding action. and ensuring that her daughter's name was never forgotten. Serena Abbotsway was from the Tahltan Nation in northern British Columbia. She was born in 1971. She was a gentle soul. Those who knew her said, kind and quiet. She struggled with addiction and ended up in the downtown East Side. She was last seen in August 2001. Her identification documents would be found on Robert Pickton's farm during the weapons search that finally broke the case open. Mona Wilson was born in 1975 in Prince George. She was a member of the Nadle Wu-Ten First Nation. She was described as a warm, loving person who loved to dance. She disappeared in November 2001. Her DNA would be found on Pickton's property. These are just 6 of the women, but there were so many more. Jacqueline McDonald, Diane Rock, Heather Bottomley, Brenda Wolfe, Patricia Johnson, Helen Hallmark, Jennifer Firminger, Heather Chinook, Tanya Hollick, Sherry Irving, Inga Hall, Cindy Beck, Tiffany Drew, Sarah Lewis, and on and on. They were Indigenous, white, Asian, Black. They were from all over Canada. They were mothers, daughters, sisters. They were human beings, and they were being erased, one by one, while the world looked the other way. The idea that no one knew what was happening on the Pickton farm is a lie. People knew, women knew, advocates knew, and, most damningly, the police were told repeatedly, and they did nothing. Let's go back to March 23, 1997. A woman named Wendy Lynn Eistetter arrives at Eagle Ridge Hospital in Port Coquitlam. She has been stabbed multiple times. She is bleeding heavily. She is terrified. She tells the nurses a harrowing story. She is a sex worker. Earlier that day, she went with a man to a farm. That man's name, she says, is Robert Pickton. He took her to his trailer, and then he handcuffed her. He produced a knife. He started stabbing her. She fought back. She managed to grab the knife. In the struggle, she stabbed him too. She escaped. She ran. She found help. Police are called. They go to the Pickton farm. They find Robert Pickton, who also needs medical treatment. He has a stab wound. He is arrested and charged with attempted murder. Released on a $2,000 bond. This is an open and shut case. A woman was stabbed. She identified her attacker. The attacker has a matching wound. Case closed. Except it wasn't. The Crown prosecutor looked at the case. They looked at Wendy. She was a sex worker. She was a drug addict. She had a criminal record. The prosecutor decided that she was too unstable to be a credible witness. They feared a jury wouldn't believe her. On January 27, 1998, the attempted murder charge against Robert Pickton was stayed, dropped. He walked. Wendy was one of the lucky ones. She survived. But the message sent to Robert Pickton was unmistakable. You can do this. No one will believe them. No one will care. Then there was Bill Hiscox. Bill worked for the Pickton brothers for years. He was a heavy equipment operator, a tough guy. Not prone to flights of fancy, but he saw things on that farm that bothered him. He saw the stream of women coming and going. He saw their belongings lying around, and he saw the faces in the newspaper. In the fall of 1999, Bill Hiscox called the police. He told them he had seen identification and personal effects belonging to missing women in the trailer of Robert Pickton. He was specific. He was credible. He was an eyewitness. Police responded. They went to the farm. They looked around. They found nothing. They left. Bill Hiscox was not satisfied. He went to the media. He spoke to a reporter from the Vancouver Sun, saying, quote, "I know what I saw. Those women were there." End quote. Then, In June 1999, another tip. This one was even more direct. A source, whose identity has never been publicly revealed, contacted the police with chilling information. Robert Pickton has a freezer in his workshop. Inside that freezer are human body parts, organs, flesh. This is not a vague tip. This is a specific, actionable, horrifying piece of intelligence. Police respond again. They go to the farm. They go to the workshop. They see the freezer. They do not open it. They leave. Why? The question haunts the entire case. The official explanation is that they didn't have probable cause to open the freezer without a warrant, but they were there, on the property. They had a tip. They had a freezer. They could have gotten a warrant. They could have looked. They didn't. Later, during the investigation, they would open that freezer. They would find evidence of multiple victims. The women of the downtown East Side were not silent either. They held marches. They held vigils. They handed out flyers with pictures of the missing. They pleaded with police to take it seriously. The police response, when they bothered to respond at all, was dismissive. They coined a phrase, quote, lifestyle absentees. The women, they said, were probably just moved away. They were addicts, prostitutes. They were transient. They didn't have real lives. They weren't really missing. This systemic indifference, this dehumanization, was Robert Pickton's greatest weapon. He hunted in plain sight, protected by the prejudice of a society that had already decided that these women didn't matter. By the late 1990s, the number of missing women was impossible to ignore. A coalition of community groups, advocates, and family members formed the Missing Women's Task Force, in all but name. They kept their own lists. They tracked their own cases. They pleaded with the Vancouver Police Department to create a formal task force. In 1998, a joint force operation between the Vancouver Police and the RCMP was finally formed. It was called Project Amelia, named after Amelia Earhart, a nod to the idea of missing persons who might never be found. The very name betrayed a certain pessimism. But Project Amelia was under-resourced and, critics say, undermotivated. They focused on the theory that the women were victims of a serial killer, but they also pursued other leads, including the possibility that the women had simply left on their own. The lifestyle absentee label persisted. They had lists of suspects. Robert Pickton was on that list. But he was one of many, and despite the tips, despite the attempted murder charge, despite Bill Hiscox, despite the freezer tip, he was never prioritized. There was also a jurisdictional issue. The farm was in Port Coquitlam, which is RCMP territory. The women were disappearing from Vancouver, which is city police territory. The two forces didn't always communicate well. There was friction, rivalry, a reluctance to share information. Robert Pickton fell through the cracks between them. In 2001, the situation escalated. The family of Sarah DeVries hired a private investigator. The families of other missing women held a news conference. They presented their own evidence, their own lists. They demanded action. Finally, in the fall of 2001, the RCMP launched a new, more intensive investigation. They started looking more closely at Robert Pickton, but before they could act, the case was broken by a fluke. On February 5, 2002, a team of RCMP officers executed a search warrant at the Pickton farm, but they weren't there for the missing women. They were there for guns. Pickton brothers had a history of firearms offenses. David had been in trouble for weapons before. The police had information that there were illegal firearms on the property. It was a routine warrant, the kind that gets executed hundreds of times a year across Canada. They arrested both Robert and David without incident. And then, as they began to search, they started finding things that made no sense for a routine gun bust. An asthma inhaler? Why was there an asthma inhaler in a pig farmer's trailer? Used syringes, lots of them. And then, the bombshell. Identification documents. A care card, a driver's license, a social insurance card. They belonged to a missing woman named Serena Abbotsway. The officers on the scene knew immediately that this was huge. They stopped the search. They secured the property. They called their superiors. The next day, they were back with a new warrant, this time for the investigation of missing women. And what they found defied comprehension. The property at 953 Dominion Avenue was vast, 7 acres of junk, trailers, barns, and pens. But the epicenter of the horror was Robert's trailer and the adjacent workshop. In the workshop, there was a large industrial freezer. They opened it. Inside, they found plastic bags and buckets. Inside the bags and buckets, they found human remains, severed hands, feet, organs, flesh. They also found personal effects belonging to dozens of women, jewelry, clothing, identification. They found a .22 caliber revolver with adult toys taped to the barrel. Pickton would later claim this was a homemade silencer, a claim that is both absurd and deeply disturbing. They found boxes of ammunition, night vision goggles, and multiple pairs of fern-lined handcuffs. Robert Pickton was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Serena Abbotsway and Mona Wilson. It was February 22, 2002. The largest and most expensive criminal investigation in Canadian history had begun. The Pickton farm was transformed into a crime scene unlike anything Canada had ever seen. It became an archaeological dig. Forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and RCMP investigators descended on the property. They set up a command center. They brought up heavy equipment. They established a grid system and began to sift through every inch of soil. The scale was staggering. They dug up the pig pens. They searched the slaughterhouse. They sifted through the garbage. They drained the pond. They brought in portable conveyor belts to move the soil through fine mesh screens, looking for bone fragments, teeth, any trace of human remains. Pigs, they quickly learned, were efficient. Pigs are omnivores. They will eat almost anything, including flesh and bone. They don't digest teeth, but they will crush and consume bone. The investigators had to distinguish between animal bones and human bones, a painstaking process. The discoveries were grotesque and heartbreaking. A human jawbone was found in a feeding trough near the slaughterhouse. Skulls were found, some of them sawed in half vertically, as if someone had been practicing dissection. Hands and feet were found in buckets. A woman's hip bone was found in a garbage pile. They found DNA, so much DNA. The forensic scientists would eventually match the DNA of dozens of women to items found on the farm, to clothing, to tools, to the structure itself. The farm was, in effect, a mass grave. As the dig continued, the charges against Pickton multiplied. In April 2002, he was charged with 3 more murders: Jacqueline McDonald, Diane Rock, and Heather Bottomley. Then, Andrea Josbury and Brenda Wolfe. Then, Georgina Papin, Patricia Johnson, Helen Hallmark, Jennifer Firminger, Heather Chinook, Tanya Hollick, Sherry Irving, Inga Hall. By 2005, the total number of women Pickton was charged with killing reached 27. But the investigation suggested the true number was far higher. Forensic anthropologists estimated that the remains of at least 33 women had been found on the property. Pickton himself would later confess to killing 49. And then there was the rumor that would become a public health warning. In March 2004, the British Columbia government issued a statement that sent shockwaves through the province. Robert Pickton, they announced, may have ground up human flesh and mixed it with pork that he sold to the public. They said the risk of disease was low, especially if the meat was well cooked. But the implication was sickening. The butcher had found a way to make his victims disappear completely, erasing them from existence. He had reportedly told people that this was the best way to get rid of a body. Feed them to the pigs, and they'd be gone in a day. The pigs, it seemed, were not the only ones consuming human flesh. The trial of Robert William Pickton began on January 22, 2007, at the Law Courts in New Westminster, British Columbia. It was a fortress. The courtroom was ringed by bulletproof glass. Security was unprecedented. The world's media had descended on the small city. Pickton sat in the prisoner's box, a thick-set man with thinning gray hair and a blank expression. He wore a dark suit, a far cry from the filthy coveralls he'd worn on the farm. He showed no emotion. He rarely looked at the gallery where the families of the victims sat, holding photographs, clutching each other's hands. Because of the sheer volume of evidence, the judge had made a controversial decision. The trial would be split. The Crown would proceed on just 6 counts of first-degree murder, representing 6 women: Marnie Frey, Serena Abbotsway, Georgina Papin, Andrea Josbury, Brenda Wolfe, and Mona Wilson. If convicted, there would be a second trial for the remaining 20 charges. It was a practical decision, but it was agonizing for the families of the other women who would have to wait years for their day in court. The Crown's case was devastating. Prosecutor Darrell Previtt laid out the evidence in painstaking detail. He described the forensic findings, the DNA matches, the personal effects. He described the slaughterhouse, the freezers, the buckets of body parts. He described the .22 caliber revolver with the adult toys attached, the handcuffs, the night vision goggles. But the most damning piece of evidence was something the jury would hear on a tape. After his arrest, Pickton had been placed in a cell with an undercover police officer, posing as a fellow inmate. The officer, who went by the name Mr. X during the trial and was an experienced undercover operative. He engaged Pickton in conversation, building rapport, and eventually Pickton began to talk and talk. The undercover operation was a masterpiece of police work. The officer, a man with the ability to blend in, to seem like just another criminal, spent hours with Pickton. They talked about prison life, about women, about crime. And slowly, carefully, the officer steered the conversation toward the missing women. Pickton, it turned out, was willing to talk. He was proud of what he had done. On the tape, which was played in court, Pickton's voice is flat, unemotional, almost casual. He tells the undercover officer that he picked up women from the downtown east side. He says he took them to the farm, and then he describes in chilling detail what he did to them. He talks about killing them. He talks about disposing of the bodies. He talks about feeding them to the pigs. And then he drops the bombshell. Quote, "I was going to do one more," he says, "to make it an even 50. The courtroom is silent. Families weep. The jurors sit frozen. Pickton tells the officer that he had killed 49 women, 49, and he was caught before he could make it 50. He says he got caught because he got sloppy. He left evidence. He stopped being careful. The defense would later argue that Pickton was lying, that he was bragging, that he was a pathetic man trying to make himself seem important. But the details he provided, the specifics of how he killed, how he disposed of the bodies, how he selected his victims, these details matched the forensic evidence. They matched the known facts of the case. The confession was the centerpiece of the Crown's case. It was the voice of the killer himself, speaking without lawyers, without preparation, without any reason to lie. He was proud. He was boastful. He was a monster who thought he had gotten away with it. The trial also heard from witnesses who had been to the farm, who had seen Pickton with women, who had heard him make disturbing comments. One witness, a friend of Pickton's named Scott Chubb, testified that Pickton had told him, quote, "Good way to kill a heroin addict," end quote, was to inject them with windshield washer fluid. Another associate, Andrew Bellwood, said Pickton described handcuffing and strangling sex workers, then bleeding and gutting them, just like he did with the pig. The picture that emerged was of a man who had completely objectified his victims. They were not people to him, they were meat. They were a problem to be disposed of. They were a hobby. The trial lasted for months. The jury heard from over 100 witnesses. They saw thousands of exhibits. They listened to the confession. They saw the photographs of the farm, the buckets, the bones. On December 9th, 2007, after deliberating for 10 days, the jury returned with its verdict. Robert Pickton was found not guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom gasped. Families cried out in anguish. What did this mean? It meant the jury did not believe the Crown had proven that the killings were planned and deliberate, which is the legal definition of first-degree murder in Canada. Instead, they found him guilty of the lesser charge of second-degree murder for all 6 women. Second-degree murder still carries a life sentence, but it allows for the possibility of parole after 10 to 25 years. The judge would decide the exact term. On December 11, 2007, Justice James Williams delivered the sentence. He called Pickton's crimes horrific and brutal. He said the pain and suffering inflicted on the victims and their families was beyond comprehension. He sentenced Robert Pickton to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence available for second-degree murder at the time. It was, in effect, a life sentence. Pickton was 58 years old. He would be 83 before he could even apply for parole. But for the families of the 6 women, and for the families of the 20 others he was charged with killing, and for the families of dozens more he confessed to, the verdict was a bitter pill. He was guilty, but not guilty enough. He was a monster, but the legal system had only acknowledged a fraction of his crimes. After the trial, the question loomed, what about the other 20 charges? What about the other women? The Crown had a decision to make. A second trial would be incredibly expensive, potentially lasting years. It would require putting the families through the trauma again, and it would result, almost certainly, in the same sentence, life with no parole for 25 years, which Pickton was already serving. In 2010, the Crown made its decision. They announced they were staying the remaining 20 murder charges. The charges were dropped, not because Pickton was innocent, but because the Crown felt it was not in the public interest to proceed. For the families of those 20 women, It was a second injustice. They were denied their day in court. They were denied the official recognition that their loved ones was a victim of Robert Pickton. The legal system had failed them again. The decision sparked outrage. Advocates for missing women, Indigenous leaders, and family members condemned the Crown. They said it was a continuation of the same pattern of devaluing the lives of these women. If these had been 20 middle-class white women from the suburbs, they argued, would the Crown have dropped the charges? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The Pickton case also forced a broader reckoning. The British Columbia government launched the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry, headed by former Attorney General Wally Opal. The inquiry was tasked with investigating how the police had failed to catch Pickton sooner, despite years of warnings. The inquiry's final report, released in 2012, was damning. It confirmed what the families and advocates had been saying for years. The police had been guilty of systemic bias. The women were dismissed because they were sex workers, because they were addicts, because they were Indigenous. The lifestyle absentee label was a disgrace. The missed tips, the unopened freezer, the failure to connect the dots. All of it was a result of a deep-seated prejudice that these lives didn't matter. The report made 63 recommendations for improving policing, for better coordination between forces, and for treating missing persons cases with the seriousness they deserve. Whether those recommendations have been fully implemented is a matter of ongoing debate. One of the most important aspects of the Pickton case is its connection to the broader issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG in Canada. A disproportionate number of Pickton's victims were Indigenous. Of the 33 women whose remains were found on the farm, a significant percentage were Indigenous. This is not a coincidence. It is a reflection of a long, dark history. Indigenous women in Canada are overrepresented among the victims of violence. They are more likely to be poor, more likely to be homeless. They are more likely to be involved in the sex trade. This vulnerability is a direct result of colonialism, the residential schools that tore apart families, the 60s scoop that removed Indigenous children from their communities, the systemic racism that persists in every institution. The downtown East Side is a gathering place for this tragedy. Indigenous women from across Western Canada end up there, displaced from their communities, struggling with intergenerational trauma, addiction, and poverty. They are the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And Robert Pickton, knowingly or not, targeted them. He hunted where the hunting was easiest. He killed women who he knew, on some level, would not be missed. He was able to kill for so long because of a racist, classist system that had already decided that these women's lives were less valuable. The MMIWG National Inquiry, which released its final report in 2019, declared that the violence against Indigenous women constitutes a genocide. The Pickton case is a stark example of that genocide in action. It is not just the story of one man's evil. It is the story of a society that created the conditions for that evil to flourish. After his conviction, Robert Pickton was sent to Kent Institution in British Columbia, a maximum security prison. He was placed in protective custody, isolated from the general population. A child killer, a serial killer, a man who fed people to pigs. He was at the bottom of the prison hierarchy. He would have been killed within days in general population. In 2018, he was transferred across the country
to Port Cartier Institution in Quebec. It's a fortress-like prison in a remote, snowy landscape, far from the media and the families of his victims. He faded from the headlines. He became just another aging inmate, serving out his days in a concrete cell. But the story didn't end there. On May 19th, 2024, inside Port Cartier, it was a Sunday afternoon, around 5:15 p.m. Medication was being distributed to inmates in the unit where Pickton was housed. The routine was normal. The guards were present. Suddenly, another inmate, a 51-year-old man named Martin Charret, attacked Robert Pickton in the common area. The details are still emerging, but the attack was swift and brutal. Guards rushed to intervene. They broke up the fight. The attacker was subdued. But it wasn't over. Minutes later, as the guards were trying to restore order, the attacker grabbed a broom. He broke the handle off, and then, with the jagged, broken end, he drove it into Robert Pickton's face. The guards intervened again, but the damage was done. Pickton was rushed to a local hospital, then airlifted by helicopter to a trauma center in Quebec City. He was placed on life support in the intensive care unit. For 12 days, he clung to life. His injuries were severe: traumatic brain injury, internal bleeding. On May 31st, 2024, Robert Pickton died from his injuries. He was 74 years old. The Correctional Service of Canada launched an investigation. A report later revealed that the attacker had easy access to cleaning supplies, like brooms and mops, which were not kept in locked cabinets. Questions were raised about security protocols, about supervision, about how an inmate could obtain a weapon in a maximum security prison. Martin Charret, the attacker, was charged with murder. His motive remains unclear. Some speculate he was acting out of a desire for notoriety, or perhaps out of a twisted sense of justice. Whatever his motive, the result was the same. The man who confessed to 49 murders, who fed human beings to pigs, who terrorized a community, died on the end of a broken broom handle. A victim of the kind of brutal, impulsive violence he himself had dealt out for so long. Robert Pickton is gone. His death closes a chapter, but it doesn't close the book. The pain he caused is indelible. The families of the women he killed will never get the full accounting they deserve. The 6 women he was convicted of killing have names, but so do the 20 whose charges were stayed, and the dozens more who vanished into the mud of Dominion Avenue. The Pickton case is a scar on the Canadian consciousness. It revealed a darkness that many preferred not to see. It exposed the failure of institutions, the prejudice of a society, the vulnerability of the most marginalized. It forced a conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous women that continues to this day. The women he killed were not lifestyle absentees. They were human beings. They were Sarah DeVries, who wrote poetry and feared for her life. They were Marnie Frey, whose father never stopped holding her picture. They were Georgina Papin and her unforgettable smile. They were Andrea Josbury, whose mother searched the streets for her. They were Serena Abbotsway, gentle and quiet. They were Mona Wilson, who loved to dance. And there were so many others: Jacqueline, Diane, Heather, Brenda, Patricia, Helen, Jennifer, Heather, Tanya, Sherry, Inga, Cindy, Tiffany, Sarah. And the unnamed, the unknown, the ones who vanished without a trace. Their names are etched into the history of Canada as a reminder of a terrible failure and a call to never, ever let it happen again. The farm on Dominion Avenue is gone now. The land was sold. The buildings were demolished. A new development has risen in its place. Houses, streets, a community. But the ground beneath it is forever tainted. The bones that were never found, the spirits that were never laid to rest, they remain. They are part of the land now. They are part of the story. And the story is not over. It continues in the lives of families who still mourn. It continues in the activism of those who fight for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women. It continues in the ongoing struggle to address the roots of addiction, poverty, and violence in the downtown East Side. Robert Pickton is dead, but the questions he raised, the failures he exposed, the lives he took, they will not be forgotten. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into Robert Pickton and the women of the downtown East Side. This has been a difficult story to tell, but it is a necessary one. We must remember the victims. We must hold the systems accountable. And we must never stop asking, who are we as a society that we allowed this to happen? If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction or involved in the sex trade, there are resources available. Local shelters, harm reduction services, help exists. No one should have to walk alone. In the next episode, I will be talking about Clifford Olson. In the summer of 1981, a shadow fell over British Columbia. 11 children vanished. The man responsible was Clifford Olson, a compulsive liar, chronic criminal, and psychopath who would become one of Canada's most notorious serial killers. As always, stay safe. And please take care of yourself after listening to this episode. Do something grounding. Call a friend, pet a dog, sit in the sunlight for a few minutes. The darkness in these stories is real, but so is the light in the world. Don't forget to find it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Please follow me on Substack, Instagram, Facebook. The links are in the show notes. Stay tuned for more coffee and more crime. Bye now.